everyone. My name is Beth, and I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event. Thank you for being here. Your presence is what makes this series so meaningful. This season is themed Sowing Stories, Seeds, Ideas, Tales. It promises to be a rich, reflective exploration between creativity and the world around us. These writers remind us that stories can root us more deeply in the places we inhabit, challenging us to see them with fresh eyes. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible people who helped make tonight possible. We would first like to thank our writer, Christopher Merrill, for being our final author in the 29th season. We are also especially grateful to Linda Nemec Foster and Dr. Tony Foster, who founded the Contemporary Writer Series. Their vision and ongoing support have made it possible for us to celebrate 29 remarkable seasons of bringing writers and readers together. And next year, we will celebrate an exciting milestone, the 30th anniversary of the Contemporary Writer Series. Our official lineup will include the following authors: Sarah Kay on September 17, co-sponsored by the Jane Hibbert Idema Women's and Gender Studies Center. Joy Harjo on November 12. CWS will present a celebration of student poetry on February 18. And finally, Luis Alberto Urrea will wrap up our 30th season on March 18. And if you missed any of those dates, don't worry. We'll make all of this available to you on the Aquinas College website as we finalize details. I will now read our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge this land, Aquinas Campus and Marywood Campus, are gifts of the Great Spirit's creation and the ancestral home of the Anishinaabe, the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi tribal peoples of the Three Fires Confederacy. Land acres, now known as Michigan, were stolen from Indigenous peoples through misunderstood treaties, broken promises, and forced removal. We strive to understand our debt to Native peoples past and realize the importance of developing relationships with present-day Native peoples. I now ask that everyone please take a moment to silence all cell phones and electronic devices. You are welcome and encouraged to take written notes, and if you would like to revisit tonight's presentation, the recording will be available on the Aquinas College YouTube channel. There will be a short Q&A session at the end. If you have a question, we ask that you please use these two microphones in the aisles. And following the Q&A, there will be a book signing and cookies in the hall. Again, thank you so much for your attendance. I now invite Mitchell Krapek up to the mic to give the introduction.
Hello, and welcome to the third and final installment of Aquinas College's 2025 to 2026 Creative Writer Series. My name is Mitchell Krapek, and I am blessed to introduce author and poet Christopher Merrill. Merrill is an accomplished poet, having published 8 collections, including Watch Fire and The Road to Lviv, for which he received the Lavan Younger Poets Award from the Academy of American Poets. He is also a prolific author, having written 6 nonfiction books. Chris is the director of the University of Iowa's International Writers Program, and in 2012 was appointed to the National Council of the Humanities by President Barack Obama. In addition to this, Chris has done many cultural diplomatic work, including through UNESCO as a part of the U.S. National Commission on Humanities. To say that he's been busy is an understatement. When I started looking into Chris's work, I do have to admit I was a bit wary, not because of his talent, but because, to be honest, I'm not the biggest poetry buff. Listening to Shakespeare and poetry slams makes me want to run a 5K, which is saying a lot for someone like me. However, my cynicism was quickly disposed of when I started reading from Chris's latest poetry collection, Flares. The first poem I set my eyes on in the collection was called Explain Yourself, which on first read utterly baffled me. The setup was manic in a patchwork way that I would almost call Dada-esque. The way Chris moved from snapshot to snapshot, the old woman afraid of a spirit, an old beggar on a corner, a slaughtered pig, threw me for a loop. I then moved on, thinking that it was just a weird fluke poem. Soon after, I read Venom, when I started to realize what Chris was doing. Merrill inextricably blended the stories of a tired martial arts instructor and a zookeeper searching for a lost snake on a molecular level, which was mind-boggling to me. What it seemed to be a schizophrenic patchwork of a poem felt more like a swirled ice cream cone of chocolate and vanilla, two different components but together as one. Later on, while doing some background research on flares, one person described it as being written with an exacting and hallucinatory eye. This is very true, and I wish I read that before going headfirst blind, which, to be fair, is a habit of mine. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, why context matters. Merrill also uses his patchwork method in a narrative sense as well. For example, in the Galapagos Islands, Merrill writes in the first-person perspective of a crew member aboard Charles Darwin's ship, observing the wildlife around him in quick snapshots, similar to how he wrote other poems and flares, but has grounding to it, partially due to the narration. So here's an excerpt of In the Galapagos Islands. He pointed out different euphorbia, Tequila darwini, of the forget-me-not family. And when we had returned to the yacht, a blue-footed booby perched on a ledge and 3 penguins standing on rocks at the edge of the shore. As for the lizard Darwin studied, it stared him in the face, as much to say, "What do you mean you pulled my tail?" A bell rang, calling us to lunch. Throughout Flares and other works, Merrill shows a love for nature and describes it in great detail. But enough talking for me. Please give a warm welcome to author, poet, and humanitarian Christopher Merrill.
Thank you, Mitchell. That was beautiful. I'm going to begin by reading a poem dedicated to my late friend Aga Shahid Ali. And when he was introduced with a particularly good introduction, he would say, "Could we just hear that again?" And I'm going to begin with this poem because I spoke earlier today in our craft talk about Shahid, who was a remarkable Kashmiri poet, died way too young, but for close to 20 years, we spoke on the phone every day, sometimes several times in a day. And in the last years of his life, he started to challenge American poets, as he said, to write real ghazals, Ghazal, in English. It's a poem that was invented a couple of millennia ago in Arabic and then adopted by Persian poets. Eventually it moved into Urdu. And into Spanish. Garcia Lorca wrote some beautiful ghazals. And so I had the good luck for 4 years to house sit for the American poet W.S. Merwin, who had 19 acres of endangered or extinct palms growing in Maui. And Shahid and I referred to Merwin's place as the Promised Land because it was so beautiful. And one day he called, and I could tell that we were going to have a long conversation. So I went to the kitchen and I put on a kettle to make some tea. And I said to Shahid, Merwin was a Buddhist, and so there was no sugar in the kitchen. And I said to Shahid, there's no sugar in the Promised Land. And Shahid immediately said, that sounds like the beginning of a ghazal. So we started playing around with that. There's no sugar in the Promised Land, swear by the olive in the sun-kissed land. And I said, it sounds a little bit like a commercial for orange juice. And eventually we got to the point of swear by the olive in the God-kissed land. In a ghazal, you rhyme a couplet, and then you repeat that rhyme through succeeding couplets but you are allowed to go in any direction that you want. So the ghazal I'm going to read for Aga Shahid Ali, who died, whose dates were 1949 to 2001, so a lot of it refers to things that we had in common, and I'll pause and explain some of them as we go. There's no sugar in the promised land, swear by the olive in the God-kissed land. I heard your laughter in the jackal's howl when the monks chanted in the psalmist's land. They knelt on the mountaintop, pilgrims of the book, until the viper in the rod hissed, stand. Prophets, oracles, and bards agree, the tyrant always plays the dumbest hand. The way you danced along the crowded bar, the saffron harvest in a star-crossed land. Our teacher, and this was Mark Strand, our teacher, moon-tanned, slept with one eye open. He was the absence of field, the sodless strand. The faithful praying in the catacombs, do they measure what they must withstand? They set sail without charts or compass, searching for the lost tribes, and never missed land. Lava and salt spray, and your final couplet. New worlds inscribed in parchment, pumice, sand. The cemeteries above Sarajevo extend the boundaries of a lost land. Your favorite show, General Hospital. Should we go for a walk? No, I'll get tanned. In Beirut, Baghdad, and Jerusalem, the war photographers are in command. The heart turned terrorist when the poet died. Now all the world's a revolutionist land. If paradise is full of stationery, write to me in your most lavish, embossed hand. Eat 7 olives, my grandmother said, and you will never live in a famished land. Another war in the Imperium. The poet's warnings can be read, glossed, scanned. Unwitnessed in the night, the empty mosques and temples burn in the beloved's land. Ragas at daybreak, Motown at midnight, you sang for everyone, a wind-tossed band. Will this Christ-bearer find his only friend in the promised land, in blessed Shahid's land? And I should note that the last couplet is called the signature couplet, and so you name yourself in the last couplet. And Christophoros, that comes from the Greek Christ-bearer. But what I do is I'm naming both myself and my friend Shahid. And the next poem I'm going to read, I know the theme is on nature tonight, so I'm going to read you a poem that I wrote, a prose poem that I wrote for my late friend Aleš Debeljak, a Slovenian poet, and it's called Sagebrush. Earlier today we were talking about objects, and that one might pay attention to an object, and in this case I was thinking about sagebrush and hoped that by writing about this I might talk about other things as well. These are the last days of its empire. No flags fly from its dead limbs, nor do its branches lost to age or blight bend in the wind. Only 2 outposts remain, 2 settlements of gray and green, in the largest house of which the general lifts his fork before casually signing marching orders for his starving troops. Here in a field of shrunken cabbages, the asthmatic priest wakes in the night, gasping. Foot soldiers reach for their inhalers. Courtesans bronze their nails. In a world of whiskers and spent flowers, there are always rumors of barbarians gathering beyond the barbed wire, the prisoners strung across the last meadow on our maps. Even our bravest cartographer prefers the company of the general to wandering past that fence, though the general will never share his food. No doubt a messenger from the capital is already on his way to the first outpost, bearing orders for our retreat. Who will inherit the promise of these stiff limbs? Ants, grass, and wind. What is the price of wisdom here? Only the priest and prisoners can tell. Now I'm going to read a couple of sections from a book called Self-Portrait with Dogwood. This book came about in a curious fashion. I was sharing a taxi ride with an editor at the annual conference of the Associated Writers and Writing Programs, and she was telling me about a new book series she wanted to publish called The Life of Trees. And she had invited a number of writers to pick a particular tree and write a book about it. And in the book, you had to talk about the etymology of the name, something about its context in the environment, any folk stories or customs that might derive from that. And immediately I said, I want to do the dogwood. As it turned out, the series went nowhere. But when I turned in the first maybe third of the book, she said, oh, okay, we're going to publish your book. The series has died, but keep going. Keep it under 50,000 words. So what I found in writing this book was that it allowed me to talk about a bunch of things, a bunch of memories, stories from my life through the lens of the dogwood tree. So I'm going to read you just the prologue, which is a couple of pages. The average lifespan of a flowering dogwood is 80 years, and at the approach of my 60th birthday, it occurred to me that I might create a self-portrait in relation to a tree that from an early age I have regarded as a talisman. Not a memoir, strictly speaking, but a literary exploration of certain events through the lens of nature, a taking stock of a journey destined to end in the earth. In the course of researching dogwoods, the common name for the woody plants of the Cornus genus found in temperate climates throughout North America, Europe, and Asia, I realized that a number of formative moments in my life had some connection to the tree named, according to one writer, because its fruit was not fit for a dog. In the nursery trade, dogwoods are called ornamentals. They're flowering a high point of spring. But they serve critical functions in the ecosystem as well. And since they have informed so much of my life, it seemed to me that an extended meditation on the intersection between personal and natural history might hold interest, if for no other reason than to offer a different way of thinking about the tradition of writing memoirs. A small deciduous tree, the flowering dogwood belongs to the understory in a hardwood forest, occupying the middle space between the ground and sky, providing nectar for pollinating insects, branches and foliage, and fruit for perching and nesting songbirds, nutrients for the soil, ingredients for medicines, wood for bowls and shuttles and tools, and an open invitation for an aging man to reflect on his walk in the sun, to reconsider his relationship to nature, to pay attention to the worlds revolving in his memory, his imagination, and all around him. So I went on to tell a lot of different kinds of stories just to give you a sense of it. As an example, I worked in a nursery outside of Seattle for several years, and the nurseryman who owned it was quite a character, a man named Jerry Monroe. To give you a sense of what a character he was, one day he drove into the woods to dig up some maidenhair ferns, which were on the endangered list. So the first thing he's doing is breaking the law by digging up these ferns. But he gets into the woods and he sees a lot of pot plants. And this infuriated him so much that he forgot about his maidenhair ferns, yanked out a bunch of the pot plants, put them in the back of his truck, and drove to downtown Kirkland, where he was going to go to the police station. But on the way to the police station, he thought, maybe I'll get some lunch. And he stopped at this hotel, and he had, as he said, a hamburger and a cup of coffee, and he promptly fell asleep only to be awakened by the police who showed up. So he would do these kinds of things, and after he had passed on, I was writing this book, and so I had the chance to have some fun with him, if you will. And I'm going to read you a short chapter from about the middle of the book, and it has to do with the time I spent in the Balkans covering the wars of succession in the former Yugoslavia, but I think also it says something about how we convert the notes that we take in any sort of travel that we do into a piece of writing. So the piece is called Besieged. Like Thoreau, I tried to, quote, live at home like a traveler, close quote, little knowing that I was about to embark on a series of journeys to the far corners of the world which would complicate my idea of home. My wife wanted to return to the Northwest, where she could find more work as a musician than in New Mexico, where we were living at the time, and so we gave notice to the owners of the estate, packed up our things, and moved to Portland. In my first year there, I wrote a book about World Cup soccer in Italy, then set off to cover the wars of succession in the former Yugoslavia. Our Portland flat was close to Washington Park, and when I had finished writing for the day, I would go for a run along its wooded trails, stopping to rest by either the Japanese stone and sand garden or the memorial to Vietnam War veterans, the Garden of Solace, where Kusa dogwoods bloomed in spring and the scarlet bark of Siberian dogwoods, Cornus alba, mesmerized in winter. Freed from my desk, I breathed the fresh air in rain and sunshine, letting my mind wander over what I had witnessed abroad and unearthed in research, seeking connections between one thing and another. This ritual I maintained when we moved into a bungalow at the edge of Mount Tabor Park, an extinct volcanic cinder cone surrounded by nearly 200 acres of forests and reservoirs. I would run past redwoods and cedars, pines and spruces, magnolias and dogwoods, Cornus nutali and Cornus mas, the European cornel, last glimpsed on a hike in Slovenia, not far from a mountain hut crowded with refugees from Bosnia, puzzling out the structure of a book about the war, which would claim 150,000 lives and send millions more into exile. In the spring of 1993, after traveling in the Balkans for the better part of a year, I boarded a military transport plane in Split, Croatia, a humanitarian flight bound for the besieged city of Sarajevo. I had hundreds of pages of notes and no idea how to write a book, the advance for which I was rapidly spending. Maybe Airlines was what UN peacekeepers called the airlift destined to eclipse the Berlin airlift in length and scope, and on this C-130, peacekeepers, humanitarians, and journalists were crammed against crates of food and medicine. The plane made an assault landing at Butmir Airport, the front line between government and Serbian forces. The Serbs had encircled the city and were raining down shells for the longest siege in modern history. Then taxied quickly past the wreckage of another military transport plane to the terminal, which was surrounded by sandbags and barbed wire. There I climbed into an armored personnel carrier, an APC, for the drive into the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which had no natural gas, water, or electricity. It was stifling in the crowded APC. The soldiers at each checkpoint took their time going through our papers. Twisted shells of buildings rose above the Miljachka River flowing through the center of town. Cars sped along Sniper Alley, where all manner of shields had been raised, dumpsters, slabs of concrete, sheets of rusted iron, to offer some protection to pedestrians who ran or walked swiftly across open intersections with their heads down. And I should tell you at this point, so we're driving into the city, and I noticed that I was in the back, and I noticed that the driver kept looking in the rearview mirror at me. And when we finally got to the humanitarian house where I would be staying, he looked at me and he said, "You know, we went to high school together." He was a year ahead of me. I mean, small world, right? A year into the longest siege in modern history, Sarajevo was a shattered place. Serbian gunners in the surrounding hills rained down 1,000 shells a day into the city, damaging or destroying nearly every building. Snipers shot civilians, including women and children, with astonishing regularity. For food, Sarajevans relied on the airlift and the black market. It was a desperate situation, not least because the arms embargo that the international community had imposed on Yugoslavia all but prevented the ragtag Bosnian forces from defending the city. Thus, gallows humor reigned. One joke making the rounds was particularly dark. What is the difference between Auschwitz and Sarajevo? At least in Auschwitz, they had gas. Dark, right? It was an open secret that the Bosnians would soon try to break the siege, and when the uneasy calm that reigned during my first days in the city ended early one Saturday morning in a hail of shellfire, I followed several humanitarians into the basement of their rented house, a familiar refuge for Sarajevans in those days. No telling how long we might have to stay there. Terrified, I took notes, not because I expected to turn them into a piece of writing, but because the act of documenting the event calmed me. I recorded almost every conversation, story, and joke, described my surroundings in minute detail, timed the interval between the rare outgoing pop of a Bosnian grenade and the ensuing blizzard of Serbian shells. When I went to sleep that night in makeshift conditions, I had a fairly complete set of notes from one day of life in a basement under fire. And I should tell you at this point, one of the stories that I don't tell in this book, but I've told somewhere else, the guard of this house was a Bosnian who had been a professional tennis player and teacher before the war. Now he was chain smoking, and he said that when the war finally ended, his lessons would have to be 55 minutes instead of an hour because he would need 5 minutes to smoke. And I said to him, "Well, that's not very good for your health." And he looked at me and he said, "You think this is?" And so at one point, he turned on the radio. And I love this. I mean, Sarajevo was a largely Muslim city, but it's also, there are Catholic Croats and Orthodox Serbs. And he said, we were listening to Vatican radio. And he turned to me and he said, "Oh, the news is bad. It's very bad." And I said, What? And he said, "You know, this Bosnian commander near where we were staying had lost his mind. He was disobeying orders, and he just kept firing off shells into the hills, after which immediately Serbs would rain down three shells on right around our house." And I said, "That's bad." And he said, "But what's even worse?" I said, "What could be worse?" And he said, Sting, the singer, Sting has lost his voice. When I went to sleep that night, in makeshift conditions, I had a fairly complete set of notes from one day of life in a basement under fire. I also had severe spasms in my back, having wrenched it during a lull in the bombardment. I had gone upstairs to get some air, and when I stepped out onto the balcony to survey the damage, a sniper shot at me, the bullet lodging in the lintel above the door. I dove back inside, awkwardly twisting in my Kevlar vest, the heavy weight of which tore a band of muscles in my lower back, an injury that turned out to be a blessing in disguise. In the morning, barely able to walk, I caught a humanitarian flight back to Split on the Adriatic Sea, intending to return to Sarajevo after I had recuperated. No sooner did I reach my hotel, though, than I began to shake uncontrollably. Nerves, I thought, climbing into bed, where I fell asleep, chilled to the bone, only to wake some hours later drenched in sweat. "Typhus," said the doctor who took my temperature in the morning, 106 degrees. "Maybe war dysentery. I don't think you'll die," she said. "Then again, you might not want to believe me." That was encouraging. I should tell you also that I called home. I said to my wife, I said, there's something wrong. I've got to go find a doctor who speaks English. And I then did not speak to her again for 5 days, so you can imagine how that went over at home. Right? Hours passed before I was admitted to a military hospital, by which time I was delirious. What I remember of the next several days is the pleasure the nurses seemed to take in letting my intravenous bottles run dry. I was sharing a room with two convalescing Croatian soldiers who liked to watch my arms swell, or so I imagined, since only they could convince the nurses to bring me a new bottle, and they sometimes waited an hour or more to call for help. This went on for 3 days before my fever broke. It was in the wee hours of the morning that music from a radio in another room awoke me. The title track of Dire Straits' Brother in Arms. Every man has to die, Mark Knopfler sang. And when he launched into a haunting guitar solo, a wave of relief washed over me. I had heard the song only once before, 6 months earlier, on a crackly sound system in the darkening corridor of a hotel in Dubrovnik, after spending a day in a village raised by paramilitaries. And now, in a hospital farther up the coast, the music struck me with particular force. I had a vision, there is no other word for it, of how to organize my as yet unwritten book. My pain dissolved as I lay in the dark, buoyantly plotting out a triptych of the Balkan Wars. The opening section would be set in Slovenia, the first Yugoslav republic to win independence. The second would recount my journeys through Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, Macedonia, and the surrounding countries of Austria, Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. The third would tell the story of the war in Bosnia, beginning in the basement where Sarajevians had spent so many days and nights. To give readers a sense of daily life under siege, I would devote a chapter to the events and conversations I had chronicled in the basement, the thud of artillery and the fragrance of flowers in a vase, stories of atrocities committed by Serbian troops, of an adventure in the front, of heroism, debates about war crimes, military strategy, humanitarian principles, the international community's failure to end the bloodshed, what to read during a bombardment, memories of food, wine, music, a guard's confession that he tape-recorded the moans of his lovers. This was a war waged largely against civilians. The joke in Sarajevo was that if you were in the army, you had a better chance of surviving than non-combatants. And I intended to give voice to some of the victims. Their testimony would be the compass for a travelogue through a modern hell, the contours of which might become clear in the course of writing. My euphoria had worn off by daybreak, and months would pass before I was well enough to return to Sarajevo. My travels in the war zones of Bosnia and Herzegovina were just beginning, and I knew that my interviews on all sides of the conflict would leave me feeling lost if I did not learn to hold in mind competing narratives. To gain insight into this troubled part of the world, I would read widely in history and literature, political theory and theology, consult humanitarians, civil society experts, military monitors, test ideas in public forums. More danger, bewilderment, and sorrow lay ahead of me, but I had glimpsed the outlines of a book. Page by page, at my desk and in the woods around the volcano, I would try to heal myself. That's the war. And I think I will close with a couple of prose poems for you. That gives you, I hope that gives you a sense of what would lead to some of the subsequent books that I would write. And I think I'll give you from a different war. This is from Afghanistan. It's called, no, that's not the poem I want. It's called Samangan. It's a place near the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan. If you saw the Clint Eastwood movie 12 Strong, when they invade Mazar-e-Sharif, that's where this starts. What are the odds of surviving a high-speed, head-on collision on a rural highway in Afghanistan? All I knew in the moments before a taxi passing a truck veered into our car was that it would hurt. My hosts, believing the Taliban would not disrupt our journey to a pre-Islamic shrine in Samangan, had advised me to wear a light green shalwar and kameez, pajama-like trousers, and a tunic. Hence the man who pulled me from the car thought I was Afghan. A crowd had gathered, which suggested how long I had been knocked out, and they were yelling at the taxi driver. Both cars were totaled, and both of my hosts had broken their arms. A doctor from our group was cradling an unconscious boy whose fate we would not learn. What did I know? Where the Hindu Kush meets the Central Asian steppe, Buddhists carved a monastery in a hillside, which the Mujahideen later used as a base in their fight against the Soviets. The walls and ceilings of the caves were black with soot, but they had survived the Taliban, unlike the Buddhas destroyed in Bamiyan. Our guide, accompanied by a guard armed with a Kalashnikov, knew less about the stupa than the doctor who drove me through a sandstorm to a hospital in Mazar-e-Sharif. The Taliban's spring offensive was about to begin, and after an attack on Kabul, with suicide bombers and gunmen killing or wounding hundreds of men, women, and children, its Department for the Prevention of Civilian Casualties warned drivers, quote, to follow all traffic rules, close quote. A sense of humor goes a long way in a war zone. And I should add that they got me to the hotel, got me back to my guest house, and on the drive back from Samangan, I've got a concussion, I've got broken ribs, and our driver was with us. He had a compound fracture, and on the drive, the two doctors were just telling stories about IEDs blowing up and how they dealt with this or that. And we got to a certain point, and they said, well, we've got to take a detour into this village because the driver who with this compound fracture was in bad shape. So we went into a very rural village in Afghanistan, and they're jury-rigging a kind of an IV for him that we would hold up on top of the car driving back. And we're driving along, and then suddenly the sky gets almost completely black, and I said, what's that about? And then now we were in a sandstorm, and I thought, what else can go wrong here, you know? So we finally make it back to the hospital in Mazar-e-Sharif, and there's not much you can do for a concussion and for broken ribs, so they take me back to my guest house, and I walk into my room, and as soon as I walk in, Skype goes off. It was my at the time, my 13-year-old daughter calling, and she said, Daddy, Mommy bought a house. We were in the midst of moving, but I didn't know we'd gone quite that far. And she said, does that upset you? I said, no, I was just in a little car accident here. Yeah, but that's how I learned that we had a new house to live in. I think I'll end with one slightly happier poem here. In this book that I wrote with Marvin Bell, we wrote prose poems back and forth, and seeing all the talk, the east wing of the White House was recently destroyed, as you will remember. It was just torn down, and I had very fond memories of the East Wing. It's where every year presidents from 1964 on they would give out the Humanities and Arts medals to our greatest artists and scholars. And this is one of those moments. The last one that I attended, which was the last one that counted, Mel Brooks received one of the medals, and when Obama went to put it around his neck, Mel Brooks was, not a very large man. He pretended to collapse under the weight of the medal. It was that was the kind of place it was. So this is called Medicine, and each of these books had 90 what we called paras or paragraphs in them, and the last 30 in each book would have a placeholder. In this case, Different Drum, The Stone Ponies, 1967. Their only hit launched the career of Linda Ronstadt, who stood now in July 2014 in the East Room of the White House for the entrance of the President and the First Lady. Obama's remarks on the centrality to our lives of the arts and humanities concluded with the story of Lincoln presenting the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. It seems that he began the meeting by reading aloud a chapter from the humorist Artemus Ward's high-handed outrage at Utica, at the end of which he laughed and laughed. His cabinet remained silent. So he read another chapter. More silence. Lincoln closed the book. "Gentlemen," he said, "why don't you laugh? You need this medicine as much as I do." Obama joked with the artists and scholars before presenting them with medals, honoring their determination to follow their own paths. And when he confessed to once having had a crush on the singer who lost her voice to Parkinson's disease, the room swelled with laughter. The ceremony must have been a relief for him. He was coming from a video conference with European leaders to discuss imposing more sanctions on Russia, and his diplomatic efforts in the Middle East were failing. Israeli forces had bombed a school in Gaza. Hamas was about to release a video of militants emerging from a tunnel dug near a kibbutz to mount a surprise attack. And the Islamic State was advancing on Baghdad, from which a poet sent me an inscrutable couplet requesting that I edit the translation. The last line of Different Drum was running through my mind. "We'll both live a lot longer if you live without me." Mike Nesmith, who wrote the book before he joined the Monkees, is still performing. Linda Ronstadt never married. Thank you very much. And as I understand it, we'll take questions if you have questions. But I think you are to go to the microphones to do that. This is that pregnant pause. Brave soul, Tony.
Hi.
And thank you to Tony and to his wife, Linda, for making this series so great. Yeah.
You're welcome. Yesterday evening, we were talking about some of your travels, and that you had been in Iran at the request of cultural aids there, et cetera, et cetera. With what you've read tonight, any thoughts about the future of what's going on over there?
Yeah, well, I made 2 trips to Iran at the behest of the U.S. Department of State. The program that I ran for 25 years, the International Writing Program, was funded in large part by the State Department until early last year, for all the reasons you can imagine. When they terminated $1 million in grants to us the same week that they terminated all of USAID. But in 2009, and then again a few years later, I found ways to get into Iran. My mission was to see what sort of connections I might be able to forge between writers and artists in Iran and American artists and writers. And so I treasure the 2 weeks I ended up spending there. It's a remarkable country, and what I found at the time it was by far my favorite country in the Middle East. It stood in sharp contrast to all the other places that I visited. Very cosmopolitan place, well-educated citizenry. And what was remarkable to me was the genuine goodwill that so many Iranians had toward Americans. I told a story today at lunch about walking into the airport in Isfahan, which has been bombed repeatedly during these last 4 weeks. And a soldier said to I was traveling with an Iranian-American professor of accounting, and the soldier asked my colleague where I was from, and he said, America. And the soldier was like, yay, America, right? And then I went through the security, and I forgot to take my BlackBerry out of my pocket, and I set off the beeper, and the guards were just laughing their heads up. Oh, he's an American. And that was the experience I had on both times that I was there. And in fact, in retrospect, having the State Department's request to have me travel there, I realized was part of the run-up to the negotiations for the nuclear deal that Obama signed, along with Russia, China, the European Union, to halt all the development of the nuclear bomb. Of course, now what the Trump administration is hoping for is that we might get some kind of a deal like that, having just spent many billions of dollars blowing stuff up. So I think that I've been in pretty much despair for the last 4 weeks seeing this, because in fact, 2 days before we started bombing Iran, at least according to the Omani foreign minister, who was the mediator between the U.S. and Iran, the Iranians had given up, were prepared to give up almost everything. It would have been actually a better deal than Obama had gotten, but then we started a war instead. So if things continue as they are, I think we're in a world of hurt now, and we will be in even more hurt as the days go on. I'm a writer. We prefer to do things with words, not with bombs. But I see the places that have been hit. The architecture in Isfahan, there's this beautiful Armenian cathedral there that's been damaged, hasn't been destroyed. And Isfahan is known as the city of bridges. All these incredibly beautiful bridges. I don't know whether any have been destroyed or not, but so much damage has been done there. So that's it's a terrible thing. We live in a time where every time you get a notice on your phone, you're thinking, oh my God, what have we done now? What's the next world of hurt we will create? But I had the good luck to host a number of Iranian writers in the International Writing Program, and was struck always at how sophisticated, well-read these writers were. And it's our loss, it's their loss. It's a dark place to get. Yeah.
I was kind of wondering, are you planning on publishing any more books later on in the future? Do you have any ideas of what you're wanting to write about soon that could probably be published?
Next year I will publish a new and selected poems. But I think my immediate thing I'm working on is I have a book which is titled The Trials of Roger Williams, A Life. It's a biography of the Puritan divine. And I was thinking again during the land acknowledgement, I love this land acknowledgement. I was surprised at the number of tribes who actually are part of the University of Iowa's land acknowledgement, which reminds you how big that these tribes were in the day. Roger Williams was a very devout man, and he's remembered because he was banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony, mostly because he did not believe that King James and King Charles were Christ's vicar on earth, which meant that they had no title to the lands that the Puritans were settling in New England. That was problematic for the theocracy that was being created in Massachusetts. And when he was banished, I think originally Williams thought that he would like to evangelize to the Native Americans, but he got to the New World and he learned the language of the Narragansett Indians, an Algonquin language, and I think he realized they're just like we are. Why would I evangelize to them? So he wrote the first, in my view, the first really great book in American literature. It looks like a phrase book to the Narragansett language, but in fact it's an ethnographic study of the Narragansett Indians, which he wrote as he was sailing back to London in 1643, hoping to secure a patent, a royal patent or charter for what was becoming Rhode Island. It was the Providence and Rhode Island plantations. And in that patent, which he secured, is for the first time in any language, in any history, freedom of thought, liberty of conscience was enshrined. And you could go and live in Rhode Island. You could be Catholic, you could be Protestant, you could be Jewish, you could be Muslim, or nothing at all. And so that's the first effort made to separate church and state in our country, which we view as the Establishment Clause at the start of our Constitution. We regard it as central to who we are as a people, and that came about from a man who was so devoted to Christ that he did not want to contaminate faith with politics. He was a few hundred years ahead of his time, and yeah.
What a great lesson I just learned right now. Did anyone know that before? I did not. Thank you. Chris, you mentioned the liberty of thought in your explanation, and I've been a fan of your poetry for so long, but the gems that you read today about the witness to history. And, a lot of people, when they write about the past, whether it be, Ireland or America or whatever, they claim to be witness, poets of witness, but you are the real deal. You've been there. You've been in the front lines. And I am just so honored to know you, to know that here is this magnificent person and poet and writer who has done the real work. And I want to talk a little bit about that poetry of witness in a bit, but our daughter-in-law for about 10 years worked under a NATO contract for the former Yugoslav republics. Oh. And what a lot of people don't know is NATO also does peacekeeping stuff, not just war stuff, but peacekeeping stuff. Things like computer infrastructure. And she went to Bosnia because they had no system that links the fire, the police, 911 emergency together if they have floods or fires. So this is peacekeeping work that our daughter-in-law Stephanie did for about 10 years. And so she met people like the president of Croatia when they were all, their own little government. And she said, when she met the president of Serbia, it was something different. He did not like the fact that there was a woman leading this NATO subcontract. That was one thing. And the other thing was, she said to me, don't look him up. Well, guess what I do? What the mother-in-law does, I look him up. He's a war criminal. He was and I can't remember the years, but he was a war criminal that was accused of killing teenage Muslim boys, 14, 15. Not only was he proud of it, but he ran his campaign and became president on this. That's the world that we live in now. And so she says, imagine trying to have lunch with this guy. So getting back to your poetry of witness, I wanted to ask you, did you have that in your psyche before you did all the traveling, or was that really something you learned and nurtured as you were traveling for, 25 years in this program?
Well, that's a really good question. The way I will answer it is I read the prose poem for Lech Dibliak, and then we translated a book of his poems together, prose poems. And to repay the favor, he invited me to come walk across Slovenia, at the time the northernmost republic of Yugoslavia. You could do it in 2 or 3 weeks, walking through the mountains. And so I pitched a story to Sierra magazine. And I said, 2 poets in the mountains, drinking wine, in the aftermath of the Cold War, something like that. And we did make one 3-day trek through the mountains, and on the 3rd day, we ended up at a mountain hut which was filled with refugees from Croatia and Bosnia. And Aleš said to me, I don't have the heart to ask them any questions. And at that point, I thought, I'm gonna write about this. So I was in Slovenia for maybe 6 weeks. I got home, I called the editor, and I said, I think the story I'm gonna write is a little different than what we agreed to. And she said, oh, no, go ahead, just write it. So I wrote the piece. And you should know that for those of you in the creative nonfiction class, if you are commissioned to write a piece for a magazine and they don't take it, you get what's called a kill fee, which can be anywhere from 20 to maybe 50% of the fee. And so I wrote this piece, and I'm pretty sure I got the fastest kill fee in history. But I knew at that point, I thought, now I'm in. This is a story that I think I can tell. I was not at all thinking of myself as being a poet of witness. I was thinking to myself, how do I tell this story right? And so one of the principles that I developed along the way was that if I found myself parroting the arguments of one side or another in this war, that was to me a signal to get to the other side, because that meant that I was drinking the Kool-Aid, if you will, right? But I wouldn't have known that going in. It's one of the things I figured out on the way. You may have noticed in the obituaries just in the last 10 days or so, John Burns, longtime reporter for the New York Times, passed away. He was the head of the Sarajevo Bureau during that war. He was the head of the Baghdad Bureau during the Second Iraq War. One of the truly great journalists, and he said to me something that I think about at least once a week. He said that he looked at me. We were outside a press conference, and he was pointing to the mountains around Sarajevo, and he said, "This story writes itself if your eyes are open." And then he said that the New York Times had just commissioned a survey of its readers. We think of the New York Times readers as perhaps the most sophisticated in this country. And John Burns' stories were always on the front page, often above the fold. And he said to me, turns out that only 19% of our readers read the stuff about the Balkans. And I thought, well, that's sobering. So I keep that in mind, knowing that in any given circumstance, probably most people aren't going to think too much about it. But as a writer, my job, whomever I'm interviewing or writing about, my job is to get the story right, give them a fair shake, even if I despise what they're about. I mean, I'll just say this: I did a piece for what was the Men's Health, Men's Journal. I did a piece about Montenegro when in 2000 it looked like Montenegro and Serbia were going to go to war, and I managed to land an interview with a war criminal, a member of what was called Frankie's Boys. They all ended up going to The Hague, a lot of them. And I interviewed this guy in a cafe. He was clearly hyped up, perhaps on cocaine, maybe speed. And he told me such blood-curdling stories. And I thought, I was thinking to myself, God, I know he's armed. I hope, don't say anything that's going to get you killed. But I thought, I've got to listen hard. I've got to listen hard to what he says in order to tell this story. And, that's what we do as writers. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, so this will be our last one, and after there will be a book signing and cookies in the hall.
And thank you for coming to speak today. I'm Armenian myself, and your mentioning of the Armenian church in Isfahan is another. No matter where we seem to get, there always is some Armenians there in the crossfire. So, one of the things that I was thinking about during your talk is just kind of the different ways to understand a war, like through like your writing, like your nonfiction writing or your poetry. And I think one of the things that struck me when you were talking was we kind of understood the conflicts that you covered through writing a lot of the time. And now we have a lot of different ways that we can understand a conflict. We have leadership of different countries tweeting at each other. We have like war influencers and things like that. So in the age that we live in now, what do you think is the best way to understand the different conflicts that are popping off all over the world?
What a good question. During that war, I'll just say that at a certain point I was invited to give a talk at the Rand Institute in Santa Monica, California, which is a big policy, kind of a conservative place. And when I was signing in, they said, are you going to be talking about any top secret things? And I was like, I'm a writer, And they said, do you need to, this was the early days of a PowerPoint. Are you going to have a PowerPoint? Didn't even know how to make a PowerPoint. I said, I'm going to tell stories. And so I met with the people dealing with these issues there. And they worked with statistics. They were, I guess you would call pretty typical political science people. And they had one way of understanding the war. And I said to them, well, I'm going to just tell you stories from these different places to give you a flavor for what's really going on there. That is, I guess, an argument for long-form journalism. One of my heroes, as I was writing these books, was George Orwell, his Homage to Catalonia. And in fact, I quoted him at one point. There's a scene in a book I wrote called Only the Nails Remain, where I was in Sarajevo to cover the first Sarajevo Film Festival, of all things. And it was, there's a kind of a funny scene that takes place with, on the eve of the film festival, I found myself in Ancona, Italy, getting ready to get on a humanitarian flight into Sarajevo. And there were Vanessa Redgrave, Jeremy Irons, Daniel Day-Lewis, all these film stars who were going there to Sarajevo for the opening of the film festival, but they weren't able to get on the plane. And for the UN planes, you could only fly if you were a humanitarian, in my case, a journalist or a diplomat. And so Vanessa Redgrave had gotten press accreditation for the film stars with them. And Daniel Day-Lewis was sort of amazed to find out he was now a journalist. And he was like, oh, okay. And so she's talking with the UN, and she's saying, this is all about freedom of speech and this and that. And I could see that they weren't going to get on the plane, so I thought, I think I can delay my entrance just to see how this plays out tonight. So they all went back to the Hotel Federico, and they started. They're trying to talk around. They're calling the UN UNPRAFOR, and at a certain point, I'm taking notes, right, as a journalist does. And Vanessa Redgrave said to me, I said something like, "Don't you think that this is a political situation, not a civil?" And Vanessa Redgrave said, she sees me taking notes, and she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm taking notes like a journalist." And at that point she said, "Maybe it's time for us to work on this on our own." So I leave, go to the bar where I meet another stringer, an American stringer, who's trying to figure out how to get a Bosnian woman he's fallen in love with out of Sarajevo. And we're having drinks. And then in come Daniel Day-Lewis and Terry, oh my God, now I'm forgetting it, but maybe Terry Armstrong, Jim Sheridan, who did In the Name of the Father. And at a certain point they think, what we can do, we can beam our greetings into Sarajevo. And the stringer says, I know somebody at MTV, and Jim Sheridan says, I can call Bono, he's in Austria. And they're all, they're doing these things. They call MTV, and they're just so drunk that, of course, there's no way this is going to happen. And the next morning, we all go out to the airport again. They're not going to get in, and they're going to get on their chartered jet back to London. And Vanessa Redgrave and Jeremy Irons want to interview me for the BBC. And I'm thinking, this is pretty funny, right? And they said, how hard is it to get into Sarajevo? And the story, the line, the joke was, easy to get into Sarajevo, impossible to leave, because it's under siege. So anyway, I record that, they fly off. I call my wife, and I say, there were no cell phones at this time. The only way you could call in or out was on a satellite phone that cost $45 a minute. So I knew I wouldn't be speaking to her again for some time, and I said, well, you won't believe who I've spent the last day and a half with. And I list off these names, and my wife is a violinist, a rather glamorous woman, and she said, did you tell them anything about me? And I said, well, I did say to Daniel Day-Lewis that when you heard he might be there, this was the first time you'd shown any interest in traveling to the Balkans. And she said, you make me sound like a groupie. And I said, well? And she said, what did he say? I said he wanted to know what you do. What did you tell him? You're a violinist. Okay, bye. So then I was off for the next 3 or so weeks. That's a different way to talk about war, right? If I've done my job, you have a better sense of how crazy and complicated and sometimes funny it can be. Because war is like any human endeavor. It has its ambiguities, it has its civil bureaucracies that drive us crazy, it has its tragedy, it has its jokes. And I think as a writer, it's your obligation to try to capture as much of that crazy melange of impressions, ideas, insights that make up any significant human experience, and do it in a way that, with any luck, people will want to read. So I thank you for your question. I thank all of you. And I want to say a particular thanks to Gretchen Rumer, who's I had the good luck to teach almost 10 years ago in Mexico, and that's what led us here to this today. And I've had a wonderful time here. Thank you.